Hello. We continue with the father. The first act of Strindberg's play ended, you'll recall, with Laura torturing the captain by suggesting that he could never know if Bertha is his child. Only a child's mother can be sure. And this biological advantage women enjoy makes Laura, in her own words, the captain's, quote, superior enemy. Well, traumatized by this disclosure, the captain turns to his old nurse, Margaret, seeking comfort. But as usual, she infantilizes him. She says, quote, all you men, great and small, are women's children. That is, you all want to be mothered. You all want to regress to infancy. The captain feels this impulse in himself, but he tries to resist it by denouncing Margaret as an old hag. And in this state of agitation, he orders a sleigh and prepares to plunge out of his house, this house of women, into the winter night. Well, when Act 2 opens, some days have passed, and we find Laura telling more lies about the captain to the doctor, all in an attempt to have him declared insane. The gullible physician, again, inadvertently advances Laura's plans by telling her what could speed the captain's fall into madness and her empowerment. He's advising her against it, of course, but now she knows precisely what to do. He says, one must be very careful in making such accusations when a certificate of lunacy is in question. A certificate of lunacy, she asks? Yes, you must surely know that an insane person loses both civil and family rights. Oh, really? I didn't know that. Well, the doctor says, if the captain discovers your secret interference in his affairs, he will have grounds for suspicions, and they will grow like an avalanche, and besides, in doing this, you have thwarted his will and irritated him still more. Now, although she plays dumb, Laura almost certainly knows about the certificate of lunacy. She plays innocent, but the doctor gives her the idea of deepening the captain's mental instability by telling her what she should not do. She's going to invert this advice by allowing her husband to find out that she has thwarted his scientific work by interfering with his correspondence. Well, given Strindberg's depiction of how easily women deceive men and how naturally powerful they are, one has to wonder exactly how patriarchy ever came into existence at all, in his view. He doesn't really explain. Another sign of Laura's increasing power and control is the change that we see in Bertha, who now embraces the mystical, irrational forces in the house which she had earlier sought her father's protection against. Now she says, I believe spirits are at work. I heard someone singing in the attic or in the storeroom where the cradle stands. Meanwhile, like Othello, the captain tries to relieve his intolerable uncertainty by finding proof that he is Bertha's father. He looks at a photograph of his daughter, which would seem to offer some objective indication of her biological resemblance to him. But even the nurses claim that the captain and Bertha look like two peas in a pod. That isn't enough for him. After all, even the paternity of the nurse's own child is questionable. So how then can a man ever really be sure? Well, in a play set a full century before genetic testing, science, which the captain lives by, offers him no reassuring proof at all. Instead, when the captain tries to think about paternity scientifically, it seems only to establish the impossibility of ever knowing. Here's what he tells the doctor in a very strange passage on this subject. The captain says, is it true that you obtain striped foals if you cross a zebra and a mare? The doctor, astonished, says, perfectly true. And is it true that the foals continue to be striped if the breed is continued with a stallion? Yes, that's true too. That is to say, under certain conditions, a stallion can be sired to striped foals, or the opposite? Ah, yes, so it seems, says the doctor, to which the captain concludes, therefore an offspring's likeness to the father proves absolutely nothing. Don't you ever feel ridiculous as a father? I know of nothing so ludicrous as to see a father leading his children by the hand around the streets, or to hear a father talk about his children, my wife's children, he ought to say. Don't you feel how false our position as fathers really is, he asks. Now, the captain, if you think about it, isn't really making coherent sense here in this attempt to think rationally and scientifically about paternity. Within the strange formulation that he offers, Laura would seem to be the mare, the captain the zebra, and some other sexual partner, He doesn't identify or know yet about the stallion. That man could be Bertha's father, even though she looks like the captain, so he argues. But this zoological analogy seems somewhat illogical because it involves 2 generations of reproduction, not one, as in the captain's case. Well, the captain's scientific mind seems to be breaking down under the weight of his paranoia, his obsessive doubt, and his confusion. At this point, he has already come to the conclusion that he must surrender. He's ready to give up the struggle for control of Bertha if only Laura will relieve his doubts about whether he is her father. The captain tells the doctor that he will quietly surrender to the inevitable defeat if only he can gain that information. The doctor says, "Captain, your thoughts are taking a morbid turn and you really ought to control them." To which the captain says, "You must not use the word morbid. Steam boilers, as you know, explode at a certain pressure, but the same pressure is not needed for all steam boilers. Do you understand? Unfortunately, I am a man, and there is nothing for me to do now but, like a Roman, fold my arms across my breast and hold my breath till I die." Now, if the captain actually did surrender this way, passively and stoically, rather than fighting his superior enemy, Laura, if that were the case, there would be no tragedy, because after all, tragedy demands his resistance, no matter how hopeless it may be. Now, although the captain does quietly submit at times, at other moments, more notable moments, his helpless rage explodes like the steam boiler that he says he will not be. Laura has been eavesdropping on his conversation here with the doctor, and the captain knows about this eavesdropping. When he confronts her, he justly accuses Laura of subverting his work and trying to drive him insane now for many years. It is a moment of painful lucidity for him. He says, "You gnawed and nibbled at my mind so that it will soon slip the cogs and the whole mechanism will go smash. This is the approaching insanity you were waiting for, Laura." Like Wojciech, the captain knows he is going mad, which makes it so painful because he cannot stop it. And yet, in explaining this terrible situation, he speaks calmly and rationally about his loss of reason and loss of judgment. At other times, as we've seen, he is not so clear-headed and rational. Now, in this spirit of surrender, he acknowledges Laura's victory and he offers her terms of peace. He asks only one thing of his wife, to relieve his uncertainty about Bertha's paternity. But because Laura has already seen him concede defeat, the captain really has no leverage here. So rather than relieving his pain, Laura tortures him with more uncertainty when he proposes this. He says, "I offer peace." The condition, she asks, "that I may keep my reason, free me from my suspicions, and I give up the conflict." What suspicions? About Bertha's origin. Are there doubts about that? Yes, I have doubts, and you've awakened them. I? Yes, you've dropped them like henbane in my ears, and circumstances have strengthened them. Free me from the uncertainty. Tell me outright that it is true, and I will forgive you beforehand. How can I acknowledge a sin that I've not committed? What does it matter when you know that I shall not divulge it? Do you think a man would go and spread his own shame, broadcast it? If I say it isn't true, you won't be convinced. But if I say it is, then you will be convinced. You seem to hope that it is true. You seem to hope that I did cheat on you. To which the captain responds, "Yes, strangely enough, it must be, because the first supposition can't be proved. The latter can. Laura, save me and my reason. You don't seem to understand what I say. If the child is not mine, I have no control of her, and I don't want to have any." Now, this is, of course, what Laura wanted, a complete control over Bertha, but now clearly she wants more. Here, essentially, the captain is begging Laura to tell him that Bertha is not his child. The problem is that if she says he is the father, the captain can't believe her because she has lied so often. He could more readily believe her if she says that he isn't Bertha's father and that she slept with another man. Laura understands this dilemma. Believing he wasn't Bertha's father would be agony, of course, because the captain has invested so much hope in Bertha. He calls her his soul, and she is his only legacy. And yet the captain says he would now endure the loss of his belief in Bertha as his immortality and the loss of his legal authority over her and the emasculating humiliation of being a cuckold if only Laura would end his agony of doubt and tell him that he isn't Bertha's father. So paradoxically, the captain is then reduced to begging Laura to tell him that she slept with another man who fathered the child. But Laura, of course, with her boundless malice and resentment, understands this dilemma perfectly and refuses even the small act of mercy of saying, falsely or truly, you're not her father. She knows that the captain won't believe her if she says he is the father now, and that his maddening agony of doubt will continue, and therefore she refuses to say, no, you're not the father. She extends his torment, therefore, in the way that she knows will torture him. The captain says, I do not believe in hereafter. The child was my future. Note the was. That was my conception of immortality, and perhaps the only one that has any analogy in reality. If you take that away from me, you cut off my life. Tell me, who is the father? To which Laura says, you. No, I am not. Here is a buried crime that begins to stink, and what a hellish crime it is. I've borne everything without complaint because I thought myself the father of your child. This is the commonest kind of theft and the most brutal slavery. I have had 17 years of penal servitude and have been innocent. What can you give me in return for that? She said, well, now, dear, you are quite mad. Note that the captain has surrendered so abjectly to Laura here that he is willing to give her complete control over Bertha. So why is she intensifying his suffering this way by refusing to throw him the crumb, true or false, by simply saying, no, she's not your child? Why does she continue to torture him when she's gotten what she wants? Well, her sadism, we discover, is rooted in not just the natural inimical relationship of men and women for Strindberg, but her particular sadism and hatred of the captain are rooted in a deeply personal grievance that goes beyond the inevitable animosity of males and females. And this personal motive for destroying him and making him suffer emerges in the most revealing and perverse exchange in the play, when the captain begins to weep. And Laura notes this. He says, you're crying. A man. Yes, I am crying, although I am a man. But has not a man eyes? Has not a man hands, limbs, senses, thoughts, passions? He's deliberately echoing Shylock's speech in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? Why should a man complain? A soldier weep because it is unmanly? Well, why is it unmanly? To which Laura says, then, gratified, weep then, my child, as if you were with your mother once more. Do you remember when I first came into your life? I was like a second mother. Your great strong body needed nerves. You were a giant child that had either come too early into the world or perhaps was not wanted at all. The captain says, yes, that's how it was. My father and my mother's will was against my coming into the world, and consequently I was born without a will. I thought I was completing myself when you and I became one, and therefore you were allowed to rule, and I the commander of the barracks, and before the troops became obedient to you, though grew through you, looked up to you as to a more highly gifted being, listened to you, Laura, as if I had been your undeveloped child. Yes, she says, that's the way it was, and therefore I loved you as my child. But you know, you must have seen, when the nature of your feelings changed and you appeared as my lover, that I blushed, and your embraces were joy that was followed by remorseful conscience, as if my blood were ashamed. The mother became the mistress. Ugh! The captain says, I saw it, but I did not understand. I believed you despised me for my unmanliness, and I wanted to win you as a woman by being a man. To which Laura replies, yes, that was your mistake. The mother was your friend, you see, but the woman was your enemy, and love between the sexes is always strife. Yes, captain says, a strife in which you always had the advantage. Now, the captain explains that his biological mother never wanted him, and he saw in Laura, whom he met as a young man, even more than in the nurse, a maternal figure that he craved but never had. As a young man, then, he related to Laura as a dependent child, so gratified was he that she treated him as a child, that she was a mother figure. That gratified Laura's desire for maternal power over him. But when the captain felt the need to assert himself as a mature man, he made the relationship sexual. Laura admits that this gave her physical pleasure, but that pleasure was the problem. She soon felt guilt and disgust because of the pleasure she felt, since the sex seemed to her incestuous, since she felt that she was more of his mother than anything else. She was disgusted at her pleasure and holds the captain responsible for that painful guilt of what she felt when, as she says, the son became the lover, the child became the man, and the mother figure became the mistress. I hate you, she says, only when you behave as a man. I love you only when you can behave to me as a child. Now, you will note here that unlike Phaedra, Laura is definitely not sexually aroused at the thought of incest, quite the contrary. Curiously, the captain in this quasi-incestuous relationship, when as a child figure he sexualized the relationship, the captain feels no guilt for that would-be incest. Only Laura feels that guilt. And that is a curious variation on Freud's Oedipal complex, where the male child feels guilty for his sexual desire for the mother, but the mother generally does not feel any sexual guilt because she does not desire the child. Now, Laura also resents the captain's sexual overture because it was a challenge to her maternal power over him. It was his gesture of masculine independence. Ever since then, Laura has resented the captain both for his attempt to assert male independence and for the guilt that he made her feel when he eroticized their relationship. This is why Laura's revenge goes beyond just taking control of Bertha and striking out at patriarchy. She wants to do those things, yes, but given the personal nature of her hatred of the captain, what she really wants also is to punish him by reducing him to his original state of infancy with her, by driving him mad. She admits this when she said, I neither saw nor heard, when he says, I neither saw nor heard, but merely obeyed you. That's the state she wants to return him to. Laura wants to destroy his mind and to emasculate him as punishment for his sexual self-assertion, to bring him back to where he was before it. In short, she wants to inflict on the captain a kind of figurative castration to fit his sexual crime. The captain comes to understand her intentions to his horror. He says to her, I wonder what men get when they grow old and cease to be men. Those who crowed were no longer cocks, but capons. He feels reduced now to a capon himself. He also explains that when it became clear that she wanted to destroy him, I realized that my honor had been corrupted, and I wanted to blot out the memory of a great deed, an achievement, a discovery, or an honorable suicide. I wanted to go to war, but that was not permitted. It was then that I threw myself into science, and now when I am about to reach out my hand to gather in the fruits, you chop off my arm. Again, another castration image. You chop off my arm. You make me feel not like a cock, but a capon. You make me feel desexualized in what you are doing to me and driving me to a state of helpless madness like an infant. Now, you might note that Laura's aversion to sex originates in the guilt that it produced in her. But not just that, also in the momentary loss of power, the idea that a man, as a sexual partner, could give her pleasure, something she doesn't generate on her own. Yet she's aware, after all, that without a man, specifically without the captain, she wouldn't have her child Bertha. But nonetheless, Laura makes it clear that she would prefer, ideally, that pregnancy didn't require a male at all. Having fertilized her, the captain, in her view, has now fulfilled his only justifiable function, and therefore there's no reason for his continued existence. She puts it quite bluntly, you are not needed anymore, and now you must go. she tells him. Now, that word go is ambiguous. Perhaps she means go to an insane asylum because she has already fabricated a letter to the Board of Lunacy. But ultimately, by go, Laura, I think, means you must die. You must be completely destroyed, annihilated. Now, at this statement, you must go, the captain can no longer passively surrender as he has tried to. He responds to Laura's treachery by throwing the lighted lamp on his desk at her. And of course, he misses. As a familiar symbol of reason, the lamp is now extinguished, and appropriately so, because the captain is himself now descending into madness, and his reason is breaking down. His impulsive rage is futile, and he violates the premise in throwing the lamp that he would not explode like a boiler, but rather die with quiet dignity like an old Roman. He can't do that, but of course, again, the tragedy lies in his resistance. Under Laura's merciless assault, he simply can't live up to the stoical male ideal that he had described. Now, all three acts of the father, you might note, are set in the same location, the captain's study. Strindberg doesn't adhere to the classical unities of time, obviously, but he does obey the unity of place. And this location in each of the three scenes creates a kind of claustrophobic entrapment that reflects the captain's powerlessness and isolation within the house. When Act 3 opens, the captain's study, that masculine retreat, has now been taken over by the play's women. We see Laura and the nurse there as the act opens. This female usurpation reflects the way in which the captain has himself been defeated and driven into full-blown insanity by Laura's treachery. Laura has disempowered and emasculated him. And it's appropriate then that she orders Njord, quote, to take all the cartridges out of the captain's gun and pouches. Yes, another image of demasculization, of castration. We learn that the captain has been locked up in the attic, and the study door we see is barricaded with a chair to restrict or try to bar his entry should he escape the attic, a place where Bertha now believes dead spirits dwell. Early in Act 3, we hear the sound of the captain trying to saw his way out of this attic in an act of resistance. Later, he managed to burst into the study, only to be placed soon in a straitjacket. Indeed, Laura's need to have him committed is so clear that she has asked the doctor to summon personnel from the psychiatric hospital for just that purpose. We find Laura saying, "It all began, doctor, with his wild idea of not being Bertha's father, and ended with his throwing the lighted lamp in my face." Pastor, her brother, says, "That's dreadful. It's now fully developed insanity, isn't? What's done to be now?" To which Laura says, "We must try to prevent further violence, and the doctor has sent to the hospital for a straitjacket." Yes, the pastor says, fire and powder must end in an explosion. It was inevitable that he would do something violent. Well, the doctor clearly agrees with this judgment that this throwing of the lamp is a sign of dangerous insanity. He's now convinced the captain needs to be institutionalized as a result. You'll note that that lamp he threw has been replaced by another, just as Laura has now replaced the captain as the head of the household and taken over his study. The straitjacket that comes in shortly becomes a potent visual symbol of the captain's terrible helplessness, his loss of agency in Act 3, but really throughout the play. Like the shackles you remember that bind Wojciech in that final scene, the straitjacket that is placed on him distills all the forces that have restricted the captain's mind and body throughout the play. The pastor says he's not surprised the captain threw the lamp because he has found him deplorable. Okay, he disdains the captain as, quote, a weed in our garden because of the captain's atheism. He feels no sense of male solidarity with him. But a moment later, the pastor does make a surprising discovery when he inspects the captain's desk drawer and finds something that moves him. Indeed, what he finds fills him with a momentary sympathy for his defeated brother-in-law and reduces him, briefly, to tears. He says, looking into the drawer, "Good heavens, here, Laura, is your doll, and here is your christening cap. and Bertha's rattle, and your letters, and the locket. He wipes his eyes. After all, the captain must have loved you very dearly, Laura. I never kept such things. To which Laura says, I believe he used to love me, but time changes so many things. Now, this is a curious discovery, and it makes us wonder exactly why he has kept these things. Amid the vestiges of his masculine profession and interests, the guns, the magazines, the books, the captain has kept hidden in his desk drawer these sentimental tokens. As a sign of his paternal love, he's kept Bertha's rattle. That isn't so surprising. But it seems very odd that the captain has also preserved not just Laura's letters to him and the locket she gave him, but also her childhood doll and her christening cap. These tokens are unexpected from a man who denounces religion and who has viewed Laura not as a child, but as a mother figure, certainly in the early stages of their relationship. So how do we explain this incongruity? Well, let me offer two possibilities. Here's the first. Perhaps the captain kept these vestiges of Laura's childhood as fetishes to remind him of his mature authority or attempt to assert that mature authority through his sexual manhood. These innocent items from Laura's own childhood might possibly, in his mind, make her seem more childlike and unthreatening as a woman. But if their function was to do that, they're perpetuating a delusion that the captain cannot maintain. He says that he wanted to win Laura as a woman by being a man, but that was precisely what she couldn't forgive, and it's very unlikely that he could believe that she is anything other than a destructive female throughout most of their married relationship. Now, after all, she is punishing him, as we've seen, by robbing him of the manhood that he wanted to assert, tried to assert, and making him again into a helpless, dependent child. A second possibility for why he has kept these items from Laura's childhood is this. Perhaps the captain retains them because they evoke his own secret desire to regress to childhood dependency. A desire hidden in the captain, much as these items are hidden in his private drawer. Now, as a man himself, the pastor doesn't trust Laura and suspects that she has contributed to the captain's mental decline in order to gain legal control of Bertha. But the pastor acknowledges, as he puts it, that blood is thicker than water, and so he won't make these suspicions about her nefariousness public. But he does ask his sister a pointed question when he says, Laura, tell me, are you blameless in all this? Laura says, why should I be to blame because a man goes out of his mind? The pastor says, you can hardly deny that suits you pretty well to be able to educate your child as you wish. I don't understand. Oh, how I admire you. Am I to become the guardian of this free thinker? Do you know that I've always looked upon him as a weed in our garden? Am I going to be somehow legally responsible for him in the asylum? Well, how dare you say that to me as his wife? The pastor says, you are strong, Laura, incredibly strong. You're like a fox in a trap. You would rather gnaw off your own leg than let yourself be caught. Like a master thief, no accomplice, not even your own conscience. Look at yourself in the glass, Laura. You dare not. I never use a looking glass. No, you dare not. An innocent little murder that the law cannot reach. An unconscious crime. Unconscious, is that it? To which Laura, feeling uncomfortable, says, you talk too much. You must have a bad conscience yourself. Accuse me if you can. I cannot. You see, you cannot, and therefore I am innocent. Now, note that this claim, this question, are you blameless in this, and don't you feel guilty, and his suggestion that Laura surely won't be able to look at herself in the mirror because she will see signs of her sin if she looks closely, all of these things suggest that the pastor is aware that she should feel guilty and must feel guilty at some level. He wants her to admit it. Unlike Iago, though she certainly has many of Iago's tendencies, Laura is not entirely impervious to guilt. She is not, in short, without a conscience, as Iago is. In fact, her hatred and urge to revenge against the captain arose, you'll remember, from what she called her remorseful conscience after he had sexualized the mother-son relationship and made her feel, as she says, as if my blood were ashamed. So she can feel guilt. And she's certainly not without guilt for systematically driving the captain insane. But she is adept at deflecting and deceiving herself about that guilt. Why should I be to blame, she says, for my husband's madness? And she tells the pastor, you can't find any evidence of what you call my little murder. So therefore, if you can't find evidence, I'm innocent. Laura's capacity for self-deception seems to be an extension of what Strindberg regards as woman's natural talent for deceiving others. And by contrast, the captain seems incapable of deceiving himself. If he could simply convince himself that he was Bertha's father, then he wouldn't have lost his mind to begin with. But he can't, because he knows there's no scientific way he could possibly prove it. When he bursts into the study now and accuses Laura of devoting her entire married life to destroying him, Laura is able conveniently to disavow her guilt, having already done so with her brother. The captain comes in and says, "Throw this woman out," turning to the nurse. "She wants to suffocate me with her hymn book." The captain says, "Can't you manage one woman?" To which Nord says, "Oh, of course I can, but, well, you see, it's queer, but one never wants to lay hands on a woman." "Why not? Haven't they laid hands on me?" "Yes, but I can't, Captain. I can't." Laura comes in and she motions. Nord goes out. The captain, looking at his wife, says, Omphale. Now you play with the club while Hercules spins the wool." Okay, now, unable to believe that Laura isn't deliberately destroying him, he challenges her. But Laura denies all moral responsibility by claiming that she has, as she puts it, no conscious aim to get rid of you. She says, "I don't know that I've ever thought or ever intended what you think I did. It may be that a dim desire to get rid of you as an obstacle lay at the bottom of it, and if you see any design in my behavior, it's possible that it existed, although I was unconscious of it. Before God and my conscience, I feel, therefore, that I am innocent, even if I am not. Your existence has lain like a stone in my heart, lain so heavily that I tried to shake off the oppressive burden. This is the truth, and if I have unconsciously struck you down, I ask your forgiveness." My God, what a convoluted series of statements. Laura denies moral responsibility by claiming that she had no conscious aim, quote, to get rid of the captain, even though she confessed in Act 2 to him that she hated him for most of their married life and has been planning revenge against him for many years. The captain and the audience, of course, see through this lie. Now, as her husband is helpless and is about to be institutionalized, the captain stirs Laura's guilt just enough to prompt this dishonest statement. "If I had a dim desire to destroy you, well, it was unconscious, and so therefore I'm not responsible. If I've struck you down, I did it unconsciously. Oh yes, I ask your forgiveness, even though I never did anything that truly ought to make me feel guilty." Now, Laura's claim that she feels innocent, even if she isn't, indicates, of course, that she actually does feel guilty, but that she has immense powers of self-delusion and ways of deflecting that guilt, as she did here and as she did with her brother. But the fact that she has already described to the captain earlier her intentions and plans makes it clear that this is simply self-deception. This mental balancing act recalls Clytemnestra just after she kills Agamemnon, first feeling guilt and then saying that, yes, the blood is like spring rain that purifies me. Now, note that Laura's hatred for the captain is stronger than her guilt, because a moment later, with astonishing cruelty, she heightens his maddening uncertainty still more by again refusing to tell him that Bertha is not her child. That's all that he is asking for again here. As for your suspicions about the child, they are absolutely groundless. That's just what makes it so terrible, he says. If at least there were any grounds for them, it would be something to get hold of and to cling to. A fatal reality would have called forth resistance, stirred life and soul to action in me. But now my thoughts dissolve into air and my brain grinds in a void until it's on fire. Oh, put a pillow under my head and throw something over me. I'm cold. I'm terribly cold. Laura takes her shawl and spreads it over him. The nurse goes to get a pillow. Okay, now, note here that in this situation, he's unable to believe that Laura is telling the truth when she suggests that he is Bertha's father. And he remains so uncertain and so impotent because, as he puts it, there is now nothing definitive to rage against, only uncertainty, only not knowing. If you tell me the child is not mine, I can be angry and direct it against that condition. Rather, in the state of uncertainty, he feels emasculated, like the bulletless guns in his study. He puts it in his own words like he's been shooting blank cartridges, something that suggests, too, a kind of emasculation. His thoughts, he says, dissolve. And in this state, he feels chilled because his head is throbbing, and he asks for a pillow and a blanket. In response, Laura spreads her shawl over him. But it's not to comfort the captain, but rather as a demonstration of her feminine power over him and of her desire to make him go away, to disappear, to bury him. Now, the shawl is, in a sense, another version of the straitjacket. It distills both the outer and inner forces that overwhelm and are destroying the captain. It is a symbol, really, of female power. Like Wojciech, who is driven mad by a combination of powerlessness and intolerable uncertainty, the captain is driven mad by these same forces. But there are two differences, I think, between these tragic figures. First, Wojciech does discover that Marie really did sexually betray him, while the captain remains in doubt about Laura's infidelity. And second, Wojciech's rage drives him to murder Marie, whereas the captain's attempted violence, throwing the lamp, fails completely. Still, the captain's struggle against Laura in Act 3, before he suffers what is probably a fatal stroke, is tragic in the same way that Wojciech's struggles are. When the captain breaks into his study, you'll recall, he is carrying a pile of books. In one of them, he has found what he regards as evidence that all men live in doubt about the paternity of their children. He can find no evidence indicating that he is the father, but this is evidence that all men are in the same boat. He cites, among others, Telemachus in the Odyssey, the prophet Ezekiel from the Bible, and the Russian poet Pushkin. All of them confirm his conviction that, quote, a man never knows anything. Even if the law declares a child as his, a man can never really be sure. This is certainly especially true in his mind, given the intrinsic deceitfulness of women. Well, knowing that other men share this burden, unfortunately, doesn't provide the captain with any comforting sense of male solidarity. All men may suffer from their biological disadvantage and uncertainties about paternity, but each man seems to suffer alone. Now, in the captain's case, the sense of isolation is especially intense, not just because he's in a house full of women, but because the two other men who turn up there, the doctor and the pastor, have failed him in his struggles against Laura. Indeed, the captain has been her dupe. The doctor has been her dupe. The captain feels that they have therefore betrayed him, and he wants to punish these men. He tries, therefore, to infect them with his own doubts about fatherhood. Knowing that the doctor and the pastor, both fathers, regard him as a madman and as a pitiable cuckold, the captain avenges himself on their view of him and their failure to help him by suggesting that they may well be cuckolds themselves. It turns out to be very easy to do to arouse their insecurities and suspicions. Look here, Jonas, he says. Do you believe that you are the father of your children? I remember that you had a tutor in your house who had a handsome face, and the people gossiped about him. Adolf, take care. Grope under your toupee and feel if there are not two bumps there, the horns of a cuckold. Still, there are a lot of ridiculous dupes, we married men. Isn't it true, doctor? How was it with your marriage bed? Didn't you have a lieutenant in the house? Look at me, doctor. No, straight in my eyes. A major in the cavalry, was it? By God, if I don't believe he has horns too. To which the doctor, tortured, said, Captain, won't you talk about something else? Ha 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 ha. And the pastor says, do you see, Adolf, Do you see you're insane? The captain replies, Yes, I know that well enough, but if only I had the handling of your illustrious brains for a while, I'd soon have you shut up too. Both men are alarmed immediately and defensive at the idea that the children, if they believe were theirs, might not be theirs. The captain has touched a fearful nerve in them because that nerve, that insecurity, seems to exist in all men. The doctor tries to change the subject, and the pastor tries to dismiss any doubts the captain has created or aroused by declaring, Well, you're just insane, Adolf. We don't dare have to listen to you. The captain readily admits that he is insane, but he says that he could drive them into the same condition by raising doubts about paternity of their children with the prospect of social humiliation if he had enough time. Obviously, it won't take much time because he already is on the verge of it. Now, the captain then gives a strange speech that explains why, having lost both Bertha and his sanity, he now wants only to die. There's a valedictory quality to it. He says, What can keep me now that you have taken my conception of immortality from me in Bertha? What use is science and philosophy to me when I have nothing to live for? What can I do with life when I am dishonored? I grafted my right arm, my half of my brain, half my marrow on another trunk, for I believed they would knit themselves together and grow into a more perfect tree. And then someone came with a knife and cut below the graft, and now I am only half a tree. But the other half goes on growing with my arm and half my brain, while I wither and die, for they were the best parts I gave away, and now I want to die. Okay, well, note that the captain draws this analogy from botany. He wanted, he says, to create a superior child, almost eugenically, a more perfect tree by grafting his intelligence and physical strength onto Laura's trunk when they conceived Bertha. But note that Laura in this analogy is the trunk. She contributes what is dominant, therefore, in the offspring, while his graft of brain and right arm is what is secondary, what is added on. But then he says someone cut below the graft, rendering his effort at a greater or more perfect reproduction pointless. Bertha seems to contain almost nothing of it him, nothing that he can at least see or recognize. Well, who is it then who subverted his efforts by cutting, quote, below the graft? I think there are two possibilities. It could refer to a man who might be Bertha's biological father. That cut, or its possibility, makes the captain feel castrated, as if he has been cut somehow in half himself. But the other possibility is that Laura did the cutting below the graft. If the captain did contribute the best parts of himself in creating Bertha, Laura has tried to eliminate his presence in the child, cutting below the graft, by cutting him off from Bertha. Well, as he lies withering and helpless, the captain feels very little connection to the child that he wants to believe he has sired, but cannot believe. So whether he is Bertha's father or not, the child can't be what he wanted her to be. The child can't be a reflection of himself. She can't be the embodied image of his own intelligence. She can't be his version of immortality, as he puts it, who would live on after he is gone. Well, although he says he wants to die, the captain also at this time strikes out against death and against those who would like to bury him. There are even sporadic moments when he tries to reassert his male will and reclaim his child, even though he knows she has moved beyond him. When the captain admits that he threw a lamp at Laura and wished he'd hurt her, Bertha says to him, "Then you're not my father when you talk like that." Well, that would be a relief if the captain could actually believe it, that I'm not your father. There would be certitude. But he can't, because after all, how would Bertha know? He can't be sure, nor for that matter can she. A moment later, when Bertha calls him father, however, she awakens his earlier desire to direct her future, if only briefly. Now, Bertha says, "Father." The captain says, "Don't use that word again." "Oh, father, father." The captain draws her to him. "Bertha, dear, dear child, you are my child. Yes, yes, it cannot be otherwise. It is so. The other was only sickly thoughts that came from the weird wind, like pestilence and fever. Look at me, that I may see my soul in your eyes. but I see her soul too. You have two souls, and you love me with one and hate me with the other. But you must love only me. You must have only one soul, or you will never have peace, nor I either. You must have only one mind, which is the child of my mind, and one will, which is my will. To which Bertha says, but I want to be myself. Okay. The captain's declaration here is disturbing because it reveals the narcissism underlying his need to control Bertha. He wants her to be an extension of himself, of his mind, of his being, a single soul. This goes beyond wanting him, as he says, to be his legacy because he doesn't believe in a God or a heaven or a hereafter. The problem is that he sees Laura in Bertha as well as himself. So now in this passage, when he looks at Bertha, he hates her the same way Medea hates the image of Jason in her children. He loves what he can see of himself, though he sees very little. He hates what he sees of his wife. And if he can only love his own self-reflection in his child, diminished though it may be, then it is a significant character flaw in the captain. But it is one that, ironically, he shares with Laura. Consider his rage when Bertha understandably says she wants not to be her mother's will or her father's will or her mother's soul or her father's soul, but only I want to be myself. His response is, you must not. You see, I am a cannibal and I want to eat you. Your mother wanted to eat me, but she was not allowed to. I am Saturn who ate his children because it had been prophesied that they would eat him. To eat or be eaten, that is the question. If I do not eat you, you will eat me, and you have already shown your teeth. But don't be frightened, my dear child. I won't harm you. He goes and takes the revolver from the wall. Bertha trying to escape. Help, mother, help, help. He wants to kill me. And so he does, even though he claims he doesn't. Now, the captain now threatens to kill his own child and wishes that, like Saturn in Greek mythology, he could have eaten her as a cannibal when she was younger, consumed her in early childhood, because now she is becoming a version of Laura. That is, she's becoming, he feels, a female whose natural instinct is to prey on men as part of the law of the jungle. The captain wants to kill Bertha because he says she's already showing her teeth, her ferocity, and because therefore she seems destined to kill him and to kill other men. He says that when he was younger, he tried to fight against that subordination of men to women when he sexualized the relationship with Laura. But she has, after all, consumed him, destroyed him anyway. Now, the fact that the revolver that the captain grabs has been emptied of its bullets is another reminder of how he has been completely emasculated, castrated. And the captain's attempts to assert his masculine will are doomed not just by Laura's power over him as a woman, naturally stronger as she is, but also they're doomed by something else. The captain is struggling against his own desire all this time to be infantilized, to be mothered again in the way he was by the nurse who nursed him in his infancy, and by Laura in their relationship in which she played the role of mother. This desire in men for regression, Strindberg suggests, arises from the mother's infantile bond with the child, and it creates a regressive longing in the child that gives the woman that second intrinsic advantage over the male. When the nurse reenacts a scene of dressing the captain when he was a little boy, he regresses back to that time, placing himself in her maternal hands as he has wanted to, placing himself in that situation long enough for the nurse to place the straitjacket on him instead of the little child outfit that he imagines she is placing on him. She takes the revolver out of the captain's hands. And then, when you had to be dressed and didn't want to as a little boy, I had to coax you and say that you should have a coat of gold and be dressed like a prince. And then I took your little blouse that was made of green wool and held it in front of you and said, "In with both arms." And then I said, "Now sit nice and still while I button it down the back." She puts the straitjacket on. And then I said, Get up now and walk across the floor like a good boy so I can see how it fits. She leads him to the sofa. And then I said, now you must go to bed. This imprisonment in the straitjacket grimly fulfills the captain's earlier remark that he would, quote, fold my arms across my breast. But it doesn't come voluntarily like the old Roman he describes he wanted stoically to be. Rather, it comes through trickery, and we find him now looking like an infant, swaddled tightly. When the captain rouses himself and realizes what has happened and seeks to resist his own regressive desires, he orders Njord to expel the nurse. But Njord has no power to command even his military subordinate here, because Njord refuses on the grounds, as he puts it, that he cannot lay hands on a woman. As he says, it's just as if you asked me to strike the pastor. It's second nature. It's like a religion. No man ever wants to lay hands on a woman. Now, Njord's response helps to explain how men, who after all control civil law in Sweden, let themselves be blinded and manipulated by women. Patriarchy, Strindberg suggests, subverts itself by falsely imagining that women are weak and in need of protection, and therefore we may not demonstrate any physical power over them. The captain realizes now that this is all a male delusion that plays into female strength. He says even the strongest of males, Hercules, fell under the spell of Omphale. Thus the reference that he repeats again, Omphale, Omphale, now you play with the club while Hercules spins the wool. In that Bible story, Omphale appropriated Hercules' club, not Bible story, mythology, appropriated Hercules' club and made him spin wool like a woman, thus a gender reversal. Well, looking back on his life, the captain now sees that almost from the moment of his conception, women have been trying to weaken and destroy him, that it antedates even his meeting with Laura. In Aristotelian terms, I think the passage I'm about to read constitutes the captain's fullest moment of tragic recognition. Looking back, he says, my mother was my enemy when she did not want to bring me into the world. My sister was my enemy when she taught me that I must be submissive to her. The first woman I embraced was my enemy, for she gave me 10 years of illness from the love I gave her. My daughter became my enemy when she had to choose between me and you, my wife, have been my arch enemy because you never let up on me until now I lay here helpless. Now, you'll note that the captain's reference to 10 years of illness that he contracted from a woman probably refers to a bout of syphilis that he got from his first sexual experience with a prostitute. It's notable because venereal disease can often go to the brain, and indeed it might be contributing to the stroke that the captain suffers minutes later. It might be also contributing to the madness that Laura has induced. Well, after this existential protest, the captain lapses into a craving once again for the maternal breast and asks Laura to mother him when she covers him with the shawl, and he sniffs at the shawl and finds it irresistible. Laura takes her shawl and spreads it over him. Laura says, give me your hand now, friend. And the captain says, my hand? The hand that you've bound, Omphale. But then, after that moment of resistance, oh, but I feel your shawl against my mouth. It was as warm and soft as your arm, and it smells of vanilla like your hair when you were young, Laura. Yes. And again, we see this longing to revert to infantile passivity at the mother's breast. Like an infant, the captain craves the soft feel and the smell of the mothering that he once enjoyed with Laura, and perhaps even earlier with the nurse. But the shawl that she uses to cover him becomes, of course, a kind of shroud. But then, a moment after his luxuriating in this infantile regression, again, in this vacillating struggle, he tries to assert his manhood and resist the lure of infantilization and death by asking for his army coat to be brought in to replace the female shawl. Well, the nurse follows that order, but the captain following through on this last attempt at self-assertion and masculine will, tries to rise and spit at her as one who has helped to destroy him and infantilize him, only to find that he can neither get up nor spit. And thus he subsides into a final longing once again for the maternal breast. He says, "Ah, my rough lion skin that you wanted to take away from me." Hercules had a lion skin. Now he's trying to identify with Hercules and masculinity. Ah, yes, rude strength has fallen before treacherous women. Out, out with you, infernal woman. Damnation. He raises himself to spit, but falls back on the sofa. "What, have you given me a pillow, Margaret? It's so hard and so cold. No, come sit near me. There, may I put my head on your knee? So. Oh, that's warm. Bend over me now so that I can feel your breast. Oh, it's sweet to sleep against a woman's breast. A mother's or a mistress's, but the mother's is the sweetest of all. I'm so tired, so tired. Now, put me to sleep." Well, this is the ultimate reduction and regression. Like an infant. Now, you'll note that the play is set around Christmas time. And Strindberg, I think quite sacrilegiously inverts the idea of seasonal renewal by making the straitjacket a kind of grotesque parody of the Christ child's swaddling clothes. Strindberg now, in doing so, associates infantile nurturing, as he imagines the captain that he is nursing again at the nurse's, Margaret's breast. He associates this infantile nursing not with life and nourishment, but with death. Indeed, ultimately, Strindberg suggests that the male desire for infantile regression and death are one and the same urge. The captain now asks the nurse to put me to sleep, for I'm tired. A moment later, he falls into the nurse's lap, paralyzed in mind and body and on the verge of death as the massive stroke strikes. The doctor now, finally, feels profound sympathy for the captain. But it is too late. He's so disturbed by the horrible spectacle that he has seen that the doctor asks a question that Strindberg is surely himself posing. Why has this tragedy occurred? The doctor says, "You who believe that a God shapes man's destiny must go to him about this." He is speaking both of the pastor and Laura as believers. As a non-believer himself, the doctor tells them to ask God why God created the world in which injustice and cruelty and suffering of the kind he's just seen here flourish. A world in which decent men like Adolf are destroyed in mind and body. Well, Laura provides no answer to this question, but only a final act of cruelty. By confirming the nurse's claim at this point that the captain's last breath was one in which he, quote, prayed to God. This is another of Laura's lies. So gratuitous as to be sadistic. Why? Because the captain, although paralyzed by his stroke, is not yet dead. He may soon be, but not at this moment, and he may well have heard that statement, that his last words were a prayer to God. He's unable to protest that he was not doing that, and that he has not embraced God or religion. Laura very probably wants the captain to hear her lie, in the same way she wants him to hear her final triumphant, cruel appropriation of Bertha, because when Bertha comes rushing in to her arms at the end of the play, she cries, "Mother, mother," and Laura answers, "My child, my own child." Only a mother can say own, because only a mother can be so sure. But the pastor gives the play's final word, amen. Amen means so be it. And by that amen, the pastor not only sanctions this mother-daughter bond that the captain had tried to break up, sanctions it as somehow holy and legitimate, but amen on his lips also seems to make clear that Laura's female power is timeless and inevitable. So be it. It's a kind of concession on the pastor's part as a man. Okay. Now, with the father behind us, we turn to Ibsen, and let me give you an introduction. Strindberg's great contemporary, the Norwegian dramatist Henrik Ibsen, is synonymous with the birth of modern drama. He's the dominant playwright of the 19th century, and he was prolific. Ibsen's enormously influential, controversial plays dominated European theater from the 1870s all through the turn of the 20th century. In fact, after Shakespeare, Ibsen is the most frequently performed dramatist in theater history. Like Bickner, Ibsen originally planned to be a doctor in his native Oslo, but he turned to theater instead. And like Strindberg, Ibsen's work evolved over several decades, though in an opposite direction from Strindberg's. Whereas Strindberg moved from social realism to expressionistic dream plays, Ibsen began with the fantasy verse drama Peer Gynt, based on a Norwegian fairy tale, but then he became the recognized master of psychological and social realism. We see this in such celebrated plays as A Doll's House in 1879, about a woman trapped in a suffocating marriage. We see it in Ghosts in 1881, about the legacy of venereal disease in a prominent family that they have covered up for decades. We see it in An Enemy of the People in 1882, about a crusading man who is persecuted because he exposes an environmental disaster in his town. What these plays have in common is Ibsen's desire to strip away the lies that bourgeois society uses to cover over what it doesn't want to acknowledge. Ibsen's protagonist heroes in these seminal realistic plays are truth-tellers, and their compulsion to reveal the truth, to expose the lies of their class, isolates them from the rest of the social order. In these plays and others, we find often that a secret from the past is gradually revealed to the audience by a brave individual who resists the deadening influence of social and moral convention, who challenges the constricting power of conformity, and who wants to assert his or her independence and vitality. Now, occasionally these transgressive efforts succeed, but more often they fail. Ibsen's plays that follow in the late 1880s and early 1890s include The Wild Duck, Rosmerholm, and Hedda Gabler. They also explore rebellious figures struggling to expose the truth and to assert their freedom in a conformist society. But now the dramas combine social and psychological realism with an increasing emphasis on complex symbols, as we'll certainly see in Hedda Gabler. Written at the absolute peak of Ibsen's creative powers, Hedda Gabler is, I think, among his greatest plays, and it is the one that seems to me to qualify most fully as a tragedy, because the protagonist, Hedda, is destroyed by the social conventions and lies that she struggles against. Unlike Nora in A Doll's House, to which this play is often compared, Nora defiantly leaves her patriarchal husband and her smothering marriage at the end of that play with a slam of the door, whereas Hedda is unable to break free and is destroyed by the insuperable social and cultural forces that she struggles against. Ibsen's sympathy for the plight of this strong creative woman, imprisoned by her marriage and by patriarchy, could not be more different from Strindberg's misogynistic view of females. In a note that Ibsen attached to the play, he explained that the title Hedda Gabler deliberately refers to Hedda's maiden name, not to her acquired married name, which is, of course, Hedda Tesman. Ibsen writes, quote, "My intention in giving the play this name was to indicate that Hedda was to be regarded as her father's daughter rather than her husband's wife." Well, Hedda's father was an enigmatic military aristocrat, not a bourgeois pedant like Tesman, and the father's background suggests that Hedda is, by nature, too sophisticated and refined for the dull bourgeois marriage in which she is trapped. As the play opens, we find Hedda desperately bored, restless, emotionally and sexually unsatisfied. Hedda's need for creative self-expression and moral independence has been stifled, not just by her foolish, self-absorbed husband, but by patriarchy at large, which confines her to a narrow domestic sphere. Not surprisingly, Hedda's tragedy is one that still resonates with women today. I saw an excellent production of the play about 10 years ago in Brooklyn starring Cate Blanchett, and there have been memorable film versions, including one with Ingrid Bergman. Now, with this background in mind, let's take a look now at the beginning of Act 1 and at Ibsen's extremely detailed stage directions there. in this house to which Tesma and Hedda have just returned. A spacious, handsome, and tastefully furnished drawing room is decorated in dark colors. Through the window panes can be seen part of a veranda outside and trees covered with autumn foliage through a glass door in the windows. A wide stove of dark porcelain, a high-backed armchair, a cushioned footrest, and 2 footstools complement the room. Further back through the glass door we see a piano. Over the sofa hangs the portrait of a handsome elderly man in a general's uniform. A number of bouquets have been arranged about the drawing room in vases and glasses. Others lie upon the table. The floors in both rooms are covered with thick carpets. Okay, well, let's consider some of these details in the stage set. It's the interior of the house that Hedda and her new husband Tesman are moving into after spending 6 months abroad on a honeymoon trip that Hedda insisted upon, during which time Tesman conducted research and received a doctorate from a foreign university. Well, with the dark colors and the porcelain stove and the spaciousness of this room, the drawing room and the entire house are clearly tasteful and comfortable. It's not decorated in a typical bourgeois style, this dwelling, because Hedda, we learned, had said that she would never care to live anywhere in town but in Secretary Falk's old villa. This house, then, which we soon learn Tesman cannot afford on his salary, is just now being furnished in accordance with Hedda's expensive aristocratic tastes. It belonged before them to a cabinet minister. Hedda insisted that they move here not so much because she thinks the house itself is beautiful, but rather, we find out, because she places value on things that she associates with social prominence and political power. And this belonged, after all, to a cabinet minister and his wife. Social prominence and political power are things Hedda craves and has struggled to possess in her adult life as a woman, but has been unable to precisely because she is a woman. Now, the furnishings that I mentioned include 2 vestiges from Hedda's own past, when she was the daughter of the general. First, her piano, which is the only form of creative expression that Hedda, as a woman in this stifling marriage and domestic sphere, possesses. And second, the portrait of her father in military uniform. This is a reminder not just of her former life, but also a reminder of masculine power and the authority that Hedda longs for, but which is denied to her because she is a woman. At the same time, there is another association with this portrait, and that is, it's a painful reminder of Hedda's economic fall. She no longer has the money her father once had, and she had been raised in, thus her need to marry a middle-class academic. Well, Tesman's Aunt Julia reminds him of how Hedda, when she was a younger woman, used to tower over everyone in the town. Everyone looked up to her, and she seemed to respond superciliously. She's amazed that Tesman was able to win her. She says, "Well, you can't but wonder at that. General Gabler's daughter. Think of the life she was accustomed to in her father's house. Don't you remember how we used to see her riding down the road along with the general in that long black habit with the feathers of the hat? Oh, yes, I should never have dreamt in those days that she and Master George would make a match of it. Yes, who could have imagined she would ever fall to the level of a bourgeois union?" Now, the stage directions also describe this glass door, which provides a glimpse outside, and specifically at the fall foliage near the veranda. It's the suggestion of a larger world outside this house, a world that Hedda longs to as an alternative to the trap of her married life, even in this comfortable locale. Even though Hedda has chosen this house, from the moment she appears on stage, she finds it stifling because it is the place of her marriage. Even though she has chosen it, nonetheless, she wants to escape it. She wants to let in fresh air, to begin with, to dispel, among other things, the scent of the flowers that well-meaning visitors have already brought, but in a larger sense, to dispel the air of domesticity and imprisonment in marriage. Now, after Aunt Julia leaves, Hedda paces the room back and forth like a caged animal. She is horrified at the prospect of domestic life there, the life that she faces with Tesman, a life aptly symbolized by the worn-out slippers that Julia has lovingly presented to her nephew and that he so values. Hedda walks about the room, raising her arms after Julia has left and clenching her hands as if in desperation. Then she flings back the curtains from the glass door and stands there looking out. Tesman picks up the slippers from the floor. "What are you looking at, Hedda?" Hedda, once more calm and mistress of her, says, "I am only looking at the leaves. They are so yellow, so withered." Now, as much as Hedda would like to escape through the glass door, her agitated response here as she paces the room suggests that she sees no vital possibility for herself outside. The yellow, withered leaves that she does see out there seem an apt image of her own future. So in a sense, there's no more possibility or hope outside, though she'd like to break free, than there is inside. Already we sense that Hedda's restlessness, anger, and desperation are manifestations of her frustration at being a woman in late 19th century Norwegian culture. Her ambitions and her creativity have been stifled under patriarchy, where she is expected to be a wife and a mother, particularly since she is no longer independently wealthy. Now, judging from her impatience with Tesman, Hedda seems already to regret the first role of wife, and the idea of the second, motherhood, fills her with inexpressible loathing. When the utterly clueless Tesman tells his Aunt Julia to, quote, "take a good look at Hedda and admire how she is filled out on our journey," the old lady assumes that her nephew is alluding to Hedda's pregnancy, which is something that Julia had hoped for. Tesman isn't. He's amazed when it appears that she is pregnant, but Hedda's contempt for the very thought of being pregnant and that others might know that she is pregnant is immediate. She says, "Oh, do be quiet. I'm exactly now as I was when I started." Well, there's a sad truth in that statement beyond what she means. She is now married to a dull peasant that she doesn't love. And having tried to escape her domestic fate for 6 months by traveling, Hedda is back to where she started. Her situation has not changed. Unfortunately, her life seems incapable of moving forward. Now, for his part, Tesman is clearly thrilled to have won what Julia calls the beautiful Hedda Gabler, this woman who was, quote, "so beset with admirers." Tesman's so proud of this acquisition that he exhibits Hedda to Aunt Julia and others more as a prized possession or a decorative object than as a human being. He clearly has no sympathetic understanding of her or her needs, and she hates him for that. When Tesman tells Hedda, "now you belong to the family," she reacts against both Tesman's bourgeois background and the idea of belonging to anyone. She says, "I can't in the least see why. That is, I can't see why I belong to you or your family. No." Well, that statement baffles Tesman. As a man of his class and his time, he naturally assumes that Hedda wants nothing more than to run a household like any other woman should. It's symptomatic that the scholarly book Tesman plans to write and has been researching deals with, quote, "the domestic industries of Brabant during the Middle Ages." Well, his vision of domestic life as a gendered arrangement seems not to have evolved since medieval times. Hedda, by contrast, understands that marriage is a trap. When Mrs. Esvelt, Thea, confides that her repulsive husband, quote, "regards me simply as useful property, but I'm not expensive," Hedda's response to her is, "that was stupid of you." What Hedda means is this: if you're going to be stuck in a loveless union, as most women are, then at least be expensive. Spend your husband's money. Get something out of it. Hedda sees marriage as an inherently dishonest arrangement, consisting of outward forms that cover over a woman's desperate misery. She hates that lie, that domestic cover, that suggestion of a false serenity, that pretense. She hates it in the same way that she says, "I can't abide the chintz covers on the chairs." Just as she wants to remove those covers, she wants to remove that lie that women are somehow content in the marriages in which they're trapped. She most of all. Yet Hedda lies herself at times when she needs to or she wants to, and often lies, as we'll see, with Thea in manipulative ways. So even though we recognize Hedda's tragic entrapment quite early in Act 1, Ibsen does not make it easy to sympathize with her. That sympathy comes only gradually through the play, and for some readers, perhaps it may not come at all. Now, it is easy to enumerate Hedda's flaws as revealed at the start. Her class snobbery is shocking, and her lack of civility and gratitude to Aunt Julia is appalling, especially because Julia has, after all, mortgaged her own annuity so that Tesman can try to keep Hedda in the house that she demanded. Hedda insults Julia by refusing to use the intimate form of you when speaking to her, and when she mistakes Julia's hat for that of a servant, instead of apologizing, Hedda blames Julia for, quote, pitching it in the drawing room. Blame the victim. Hedda is also deeply egocentric. When Tesman says, "You can't think how many associations cling to these old slippers of mine," Hedda coldly replies, "Scarcely for me. Your slippers and your attachment to them mean nothing. I don't care about that." And yet, Hedda herself clings to vestiges of her own past, to her piano, and, to cite the play's most important symbol, to her pistols. Those, too, are vestiges of her own personal family history. Finally, to enumerate Hedda's flaws, she is prone to jealousy. Indeed, as prone to jealousy as she is to disdain for those whom she feels are her social or intellectual inferiors. Now, both of these characteristic feelings, the jealousy and the disdain for her inferiors, emerge in complex ways when Thea Esvelt visits unexpectedly and urges Tesman and Hedda to show hospitality to Eilert Lovborg. We soon discover that Lovborg is Tesman's academic rival and that he is also Hedda's former love interest from years earlier. With quick discernment, Hedda realizes that Thea has rushed to the city from the Norwegian countryside where she lives to follow Lovborg. He is a recovering alcoholic who had been tutoring her stepchildren in the country before the publication of a now much discussed, quote, big book dealing with the march of civilization. Well, the news of this accomplishment, this literary milestone, awakens Hedda's interest in Lovborg because this book that everyone's talking about is everything that Tesman's own proposed work is not. This book of Eilert Lovborg looks ahead rather than backward to the past. Its ideas aren't narrowly academic like Tesman's, but rather bold and sweeping and revolutionary. Indeed, these ideas, this book, is causing a sensation of the kind that Hedda longs and has always longed to create herself. Temperamentally, Lovborg is a passionate and restless man, in those respects very much like Hedda. He is the antithesis of Tesman, who seems incapable of any strong emotional or erotic response, whereas the emotional and the erotic are powerful within Lovborg. Lovborg is also creative, but like Hedda, he is also destructive and self-destructive when he feels that his creativity is blocked. But as a man, at least, because he is a man, unlike Hedda, he has a genuine creative outlet in the world, his work. Hedda, on the other hand, believes that her only means of power or personal expression, apart from the piano, as a woman, is to influence a man, to inspire a man to greatness as his muse and collaborator. Now, she may have had those hopes that she could do such a thing as muse and collaborator with Tesman before they married, but that was self-delusion, because she soon discovers that he is clearly too plodding and cautious and passionless to be inspired or to do anything great. Ibsen describes him in this way as tedious, and it's clear from Hedda's contempt for him that she knows that he will never rise to the level of her needs. The kind of man that she envies and is drawn to are either intellectual dynamos like Lovborg or hypermasculine figures like Judge Brock. Brock is a physically imposing man who wields political and social power, for better or for worse, some of it nefariously, as we'll see. Ibsen describes Brock as, when he first appears, a kind of pure phallic masculinity with his thick mustaches, sparkling eyes, and elastic movements. This is the kind of prominent man who luxuriates in his masculinity by throwing lavish bachelor parties, as he does on the night of the play. Now, a man like Brock is clearly beyond a woman's influence, but not a man like Lovborg, who is a mixture of immense talent, but also a man whose inner demons, like Lovborg's, are the things that a woman might feel that he needs to be helped to overcome. What astonishes Hedda and generates conflicted feelings in her during Thea's visit isn't the suspicion that Thea Esvold has fallen in love with Lovborg. No, rather what astonishes her and perplexes her is the fact that this pale little woman of, quote, fragile figure and soft features has left her abusive husband to follow the man she loves, Lovborg, to the city. But most of all, Hedda is mystified that Thea has done what she has always wanted to do, and that is inspired Lovborg to write a book for which he is being celebrated. Now, almost immediately when Thea appears, Hedda intuits that this woman has fallen in love with Lovborg and followed him to Oslo, which was then called Christiania. Wanting to confirm her suspicions, Hedda coerces Thea to disclose this and much more through an invented pretense of their girlhood intimacy. Before Thea arrived, however, we learned that Hedda disliked her and bullied her when they were schoolgirls together. She especially hated Thea's, quote, irritating hair, which Ibsen describes as, quote, light, almost flaxen, unusually abundant, and wavy. Well, what irritated and still irritates Hedda about this blonde mane of Thea's is that Hedda regards it as a mark of Thea's ultra-femininity, her conventional female softness. Hedda sees that as weakness in woman, any female softness. She sees it as a stereotypical conformity to what patriarchy wants and expects a woman to be. Hedda despises female weakness as much as she despises patriarchy. And so when Thea arrives, she delights in physically controlling and psychologically manipulating and even tormenting Thea. Thea comes in and says Hedda says, there's a great deal more I can see in you. I can see it in you. Sit here and we'll have a cozy, confidential chat. She forces Mrs. Esvold to sit in the easy chair beside the stove and seats herself on one of the footstools. Thea says, anxiously looking at her watch, but my dear Mrs. Tesman, I was really on the point of going, oh, you can't go in such a hurry. Well, now tell me something about your life at home. Oh, that is just what I care least to speak about. Oh, but my dear, weren't we schoolfellows together? Well, yes, but you were in the class above me. Oh, how dreadfully afraid of you I'd been then. Afraid of me? Yes, dreadfully. For when we would meet on the stairs, you used always to pull my hair. Did I really? Yes, and you once said that you would burn it off my head. Oh, well, that's all just nonsense, of course. Yes, but I was so silly in those days, and since then, well, we've drifted apart from each other. Our circles have been so entirely different. Ah, so now Hedda says we're going to renew our friendship. Oh, yes, let us renew it. You must call me Hedda. You must use the familiar you, the one that Hedda would not use with Julia. Now, Hedda, you'll note, literally pushes Thea into the chair, sort of entraps her, and then plays on this invented idea of their old friendship, which did not exist, to extract information from Thea about Lovborg. She tortured Thea as a girl, threatening to burn off her golden locks, and she's clearly capable of torturing her again now. Hedda was a class above Thea, as Thea puts it in school, but also a class above her socially, which enforced her abuse of power because everyone was afraid of Hedda. But note that Thea now proves to be much stronger than Hedda had expected or remembered. And Hedda's disdain for her soon combines with a more powerful feeling of jealousy over several things that I've mentioned. First, Thea confesses with relief. She admits, under this questioning, that she has left her husband, indeed. And when Hedda says, "Imagine you daring to do that," Thea says, "I shall never go back to him." Well, despite Thea's soft appearance and yielding manner, Hedda sees that she has acted rebelliously, even recklessly, in a way that Hedda herself would like to act perhaps, but has not yet risked. Hedda is constrained from rebelling against her marriage, in part because of her concern for social opinion, something that Thea courageously rejects when she explains that she has left her husband. She says, "Oh, it's impossible to keep things of this sort a secret. But what do you think people will say to you, Thea?" And Thea says, "Then they may say what they like, for all I care. I only know this, that I must live here, where Eilert Lovborg is, if I am to live at all." Now, far from conforming to Hedda's idea of feminine weakness, then, Thea arouses Hedda's jealousy by acting out Hedda's own transgressive desires. But Hedda is also jealous of Thea's close relationship with Lovborg. Even though Thea and Lovborg were not sexual lovers when she was a young woman, Thea, and even though Thea and Lovborg have not been either, Thea has at least been close to him, passionately. And she is so passionately devoted that she has indeed repudiated her marriage and risked her reputation to seek Lovborg. Thea feels, she says, enlivened by her passion, and Hedda, who complains of her own deadening boredom, envies that sense of life in Thea as one who loves and has been close recently to Lovborg. But the deepest source of Hedda's jealousy, by far, lies in what Thea refers to when she says, "I have gained a sort of influence over him." Influence. Hedda says, "Then you've reclaimed him, as the saying goes, my little Thea, yes?" And Thea says, "Yes. He talked to me, talked about such an infinity of things, and then came the lovely happy time when I began to share in his work, when he allowed me to help him." "Oh, he did? Did he?" "Yes, he never wrote anything without my assistance." "Ah," she says, "but you know, a woman's shadow now stands between Eilert Lovborg and me." Hedda asks, looking anxiously, "Who could that be?" Well, we need to remember that as a woman, Hedda believes that her only form of self-fulfillment and empowerment in life would come from influencing and shaping a man to greatness by viewing his muse and collaborator. Thea, from her own description, seems to have achieved this in her relationship with Lovborg, as his muse, his inspiration, his intellectual companion, his guide, even, as she says, his equal. And in her domestic role, she also helped Lovborg control his alcoholism, his inner demon. Well, Hedda had failed in their relationship when she was younger to inspire either the creative accomplishment in Lovborg or the self-control when they were emotionally intimate, but not sexually intimate, years earlier. She didn't inspire him, nor in those days did she save him from drunkenness and dissipation. In short, she failed in the two areas that Thea has succeeded in. So despite her accomplishment, her early relationship with Lovborg, she feels now jealous of what Thea has done. But despite Thea's achievements with Lovborg, she says she is uncertain of his love for her because she complains of, quote, the shadow of an unnamed woman who, she says, in the city stands between herself and Eilert Lovborg. Thea incorrectly assumes that the rival that she feels, this shadow, is a red-haired woman within the city, who Lovborg had known earlier. But as we later discover, that woman is one Mademoiselle Diana, a would-be singer who is actually a madame or procuress at an expensive brothel that Lovborg used to frequent in his wilder days, those days, in fact, when he knew Hedda. But clearly the real shadow that haunts Lovborg's thoughts and that is going to pose a threat to Thea is Hedda herself.